I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is Under the Dome. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney shuffled his cabinet late last week with Tyler Shandro and Casey Madu swapping places. Casey Madu was shuffled out because of a report that showed he attempted to interfere with the administration of justice over a phone call to Edmonton Police Chief Dale McPhee after receiving a distracted driving ticket. The shuffle also caused the Premier controversy because Tyler Shandro, now the Justice Minister, is facing a trio of complaints to the Law Society of Alberta for his conduct in early 2020. We take a look at that, plus dive a little bit into Alberta's budget on today's episode of Under the Dome. My guest today is Jonathan Denis. He's a former Minister of Justice and Solicitor General who served in a handful of other portfolios in successive Progressive Conservative governments. He now has a private law practice in Calgary. Jonathan, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Dave.
So there's a handful of things I want to talk about today, but the first one I want to talk about is the role that justice ministers and solicitors general play in politics, and also the idea that they shouldn't interfere with the process or the administration of justice. Now, as a broader issue, we saw this in Canada at the federal level with Jody Wilson-Raybould, who she says she was pressured by people in the Prime Minister's office to interfere with the prosecution involving large corporation. She said, when she said, I wouldn't do that, she was promptly ushered out of cabinet. Now, on a smaller scale in Alberta, we have a report from former Justice Adele Kent, looked into the conduct of now former Minister of Justice and Solicitor General Casey Madu, who and his actions when he was pulled over by Edmonton police for a distracted driving ticket. He then phoned the chief of police. And at the end of the day, Justice Kent found that Minister Madu attempted to interfere with the administration of justice and gave the perception of interference with the administration of justice. Am I reading that right? Like you've read this full report. Is that the main takeaway here?
It's a really complex report. And I'll just get into your first question. The Justice and Solicitor General is basically two departments. It became one in 2012, and I was actually the first person in many years to have both departments. Justice is basically dealing with the appointment of judges, giving legal advice to the government. Solicitor General deals with policing. So we're dealing with the justice side here today. So I've read the report. Justice Kent is a very respected former judge. I've been in a courtroom many times. The report is very thorough. And it first says that Minister Madu did not interfere with the administration of justice, but it does talk about the perception. And the biggest thing there is the perception. So it's a convention that a Minister of Justice does not even comment on matters before the courts. I will tell you, it's not uncommon for a Minister of Justice to get complaints to the Law Society. I'll give you an example. Kathleen Ganley, the former NDP Justice Minister, had a complaint against her in 2018 when she commented about a sexual assault matter, which was before the courts. So that's not uncommon. At the same time, though, the Justice Minister has to avoid any perception of any interference whatsoever. So I fully believe Minister Madu, even though he's apologized, that he did not intend to cause any issues here, but the issue really was perceptual.
Yeah. Now, I mean, looking at this report, there's some of the words that Justice Kent had to say about it. It says, the minister said the call was not about the ticket, but the ticket was the trigger. He said he was looking for some assurance from the chief that the traffic stop was not motivated by illegal surveillance or racial profiling. The next logical step would mean that he expected the chief to respond to his concerns about the ticket. There's a process that the minister knows well to address questions of police conduct does not start with a call to the police chief. Now, again, I get there are some intricacies with the law profession in Alberta, and commenting directly on his actions, may go against what the Law Society would like to see, or it could put you in hot water. So I'm not necessarily going to get you to comment on what Casey Madu did, but the idea that there's a finding that he attempted to interfere with the administration of justice and a perception that there's an interference going on, is that enough in your mind to see him removed from his position as justice minister?
So again, I think it's a perceptual issue, but I think that there's varying degrees of misconduct. Okay, so if you go back to a more egregious one, we'll go back way back to 1990. Jean Charest was a minister in the Mulroney government. I believe he was Minister of Sport, and he called a judge about a ruling. That is a big, big, big no-no. You never do something like that because the judicial system is independent, and so it should be. Once you appoint a judge, they sometimes have to make unpopular but correct decisions. Any call like that to a judge, to me, is cause for a firing. But there's different degrees of an issue here. And in this particular case, Minister Madu ended up paying the ticket. It probably wasn't a wise thing for him to call, and he has apologized to that. So I do think that Premier Kenney was justified in going and asking a retired judge to look into it because, again, a judge is the ultimate arbitrator. These people decide people's liberties. And I think it's important that the public has confidence in the process, that there's not one set of rules for somebody who has an elected office, another set of rules for the rest of us. So, again, what I think, he has apologized. He regrets saying what he did. I do think that it was wise for what Premier Kenney did, but I don't think it rises to the same level of then Minister Jean Charest calling a judge. Like, that's a big no-no.
Yeah, but I think that might be where the public kind of gets hung up here, is because even Premier Kenney himself has said, okay, well, he attempted to interfere with the administration of justice, and so he no longer can be justice minister. And I think that it's an important step for a premier to take, to decide that someone who has been in cabinet, who has served as municipal affairs minister and justice minister, to turn around and say his conduct rose to the level that I can't have him in the justice portfolio anymore. But I feel like people get stuck on the idea that, well, if his conduct was at the level where he can't remain justice minister anymore, why is he in cabinet at all? Because, as was announced Friday, he has been moved to the labor portfolio. And I'm just wondering, someone with experience as justice minister, also experience in cabinet and caucus, why would the premier make kind of that call to say, okay, your conduct wasn't at the level that we would expect out of a justice minister, so you can't stay there anymore, but we're just going to move you over here?
So to serve as the Attorney General, it's not just any other cabinet position. It's actually a very special cabinet position. You're responsible for the administration of the courts, the oversight of the police. You don't direct these institutions, but going back to the Magna Carta almost 1,000 years ago, people are supposed to be treated the same. We're supposed to be equal under the law, and that's frankly what sets our democracy aside from other systems throughout world history. It's there for a particular reason. So I would say that the reason that he was moved is more perceptual than anything else. You have to be very, very, very careful in every move that you make. People don't wake up one morning and say, gee, I'm going to try to pull a fast one. Often, you just really have to be vigilant in everything you're doing. To give you a quick story, one time I was driving from Calgary to Edmonton. I was pulled over by a sheriff near Crossfield, and admittedly, I was speeding. Mm-hmm. I was just not paying enough attention, and I was speeding. The guy pulls me over, sees that it's me, and starts laughing. And he said, the first thing I said to him is, "Sir, could you please give me the ticket?" And he says, "In 20 years, I've never heard that." But I didn't want the perception that I was asking for some sort of favor over a ticket. I should be treated like everybody else.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. This is for the Premier. I'm wondering, Premier, a group of law professors have written publicly that Tyler Shandro should have not accepted the role of Justice Minister while the Law Society looks into 3 complaints that he broke the code of conduct. I'm curious to know if you considered the possibility that this puts the Law Society in a difficult position, and what was your decision-making behind this?
No, I think that's completely untrue. The Law Society is an independent, self-governing regulatory body. It doesn't follow the direction of the Minister of Justice. These are complaints that have been made by the same people that have filed a complaint against Dr. Hinshaw at the Alberta College of Physicians, who have a hyper-politicized agenda trying to discredit our Chief Medical Officer of Health because they disagree with, I guess, statements that she has made. These regulatory bodies are independent, they're self-governing, and it's certainly not the first time we've seen politicized complaints being filed at regulatory bodies for ministers of the Crown. In fact, under the NDP, Kathleen Ganley, Minister of Justice at the time, faced a similar complaint at the Law Society for what appeared to be motivated by political reasons. So she didn't step aside. She was right to continue to serve in her position. Despite that, the independent complaints process will happen in a unencumbered by any direction from government, and that's as it should be.
And talking about this cabinet shuffle, because you're raising an important issue, and I do kind of want to change tack a bit. In this cabinet shuffle, we have Casey Madu moved out of justice because, as the Premier said, there is the perception of interference, and he did attempt to interfere with the administration of justice. And so he's moved out of Justice and Solicitor General, and he's moved to Labour. And then the Labour Minister, Tyler Shandro, is moved from his portfolio to Justice Minister and Solicitor General. This poses another interesting problem for the Premier, and there's lots of questions about Minister Shandro's appointment to Justice Minister and Solicitor General, because as you said, the Justice Minister is responsible for oversight of the court system. And as of right now, Minister Shandro has, I believe it's 3 complaints against him to the Law Society. And there's, I guess, at least a perception that that could impede or interfere in some way with these complaints against him and the process that the Law Society will have to go through. What's your take on that, that perception that the public may have, and any concerns that come up with regard to Minister Shandro's appointment?
So this can get very, very thick very quickly. I'll try to unpack it as simply as I can. The Law Society is a self-governing body. So the government has no operating authority over the Law Society. In fact, the Supreme Court has ruled that the independence of the legal profession is a cornerstone of our democratic system. I agree with that statement. So the Law Society, though, governs lawyers, not politicians. Now, again, as I mentioned, it's not uncommon for a justice minister to have complaints against him or her. Minister Ganley, as she then was, had one in 2018. I don't believe that rose to the same level. But at the same time, the question that I would ask is, to what degree does the Law Society govern, or ought they to govern, people's private lives? So, for example, if a lawyer receives a criminal charge, he or she has to advise the Law Society of that. Mm-hmm. Okay. So to me, that's a justifiable regulation, because you have to ensure that all lawyers have a good character. We're not suggesting that here. Again, Minister Shandro has apologized for going to the doctor in that particular situation. I would also just add, though, that the complaints process presumes people innocent until proven guilty. So we can't presume that Minister Shandro is automatically responsible for this. I also would add that there's a wide breadth of sanctions that the Law Society can give to a lawyer. I would highly doubt that Minister Shandro would be disbarred over this. In fact, I bet any amount of money that that's not the possible outcome, even if he was found guilty of these complaints.
Looking at another piece of this is the idea that the Justice Minister traditionally in Alberta is someone who is a lawyer. You're a lawyer, you served as Justice Minister, and there's not necessarily always a deep pool of lawyers in caucus to draw from to become Justice Minister. How important is that piece? And do you suppose there were any other options for the Premier to appoint to that position if you'd wanted to go another way?
So that is interesting. Again, the old adage is that somebody asks somebody a legal question, the answer is it depends. And this is no exception to that. I was recently on Twitter, and I went back to 1971. Every justice minister since 1971 at least has been a lawyer. Mm-hmm. That being said, it's not a legal requirement. Going back about 10 years, a former minister in the Christy Clark government, Shirley Bond in BC, she was not a lawyer, but she was appointed justice minister. Some people actually took this to the BC Supreme Court, and there was a ruling that year that indicated that it is not a legal requirement for someone to be a lawyer to be a justice minister. But I'm going to tell you something, it really helps. Yeah. It really helps. And I'd argue that it's a strong convention. You're dealing with a very large group of lawyers, some very complex issues. You're dealing with judges, you're appointing judges. It really, really helps if you have that particular legal background, as Minister Shandro does. So there are different options. Okay, so Doug Schweitzer was originally the Minister of Justice, was shuffled out to Minister of Tourism later. So that would be an option. That you then have Sonia Savage, who has been in the pipeline lobbying business quite successfully prior to before she got into office. That she served as the interim Justice Minister. That wasn't an option. Apparently, she's staying on as energy. You then have Minister Shandro, who's had a couple of positions before that. There's also some private members that would be an option. Mickey Amory would have been an option. Jason Stephan in Red Deer would have been an option, and also Nick Milliken is a lawyer in Calgary. But the interesting thing there is that the justice portfolio is so complex. I'm going to tell you, it's a very busy life. You typically have somebody who has some cabinet experience. The only time you really see somebody new put in there is when the government changes, like when the NDP took over in 2015 and then the UCP in 2019. You typically have somebody who has some cabinet experience. So practically speaking, there is a limited pool you can go from. There's relatively few lawyers actually that are in politics, contrary to the public perception.
All right, moving on from that, I did want to touch briefly on the budget. You were minister in a government that saw Alberta go from balanced budgets to structural deficits. This year, we're seeing a balanced budget, projecting a small surplus, about $500 million. What were some key takeaways for you out of the budget? And how important do you suppose it is for Alberta, but also for the Premier to kind of get things back on track, fiscally speaking, in Alberta, especially with the leadership review and election coming up?
I think it's very important, and you're quite correct that the last surplus shown was in 2014, 2015, prior to the major decline in oil prices. The NDP didn't post one surplus. They ran $10 billion plus deficits all 4 years. I did a bit of number crunching here, though, and there's some nuances here. The government is trying to show a good news budget, which hasn't happened in Alberta in a long time. Interestingly enough, I have to give the government credit for a couple things. First off, there has been reasonable forecasting. Last year, they pegged oil at $46, and people would say that's low. But I would say it's good to give reasonable forecasting because you don't end up with a big vat of red ink at the end and start overspending. Public sector costs, though, are also around the national average, and that's a big deal. We had a really difficult time when I was in office trying to get those public sector costs down. I give credit where credit is due. I do think the NDP would still be running a deficit budget if they were in power today. But here's something that's really interesting. Oil is pegged at $70 a barrel. I just checked online here. Today we're at $111 a barrel. Now, of course, a lot of that has to do with the situation in Ukraine, Russia being the largest oil exporter in the world. Let's say, for example, that the average is $90. RBC is forecasting $98. That's before the crisis. Let's just say it's at $90. The surplus of $511 million balloons at that point. The government forecast, and TD Bank has looked at this as well, $500 million in extra revenue for every dollar on a annual basis that West Texas Intermediate is above the forecast. So let's say it goes to $90. You're looking at a $10 billion surplus, billion with a B. So what happens is we go to an election next year. Interestingly enough, and you can come back to me if this prediction is correct, in 1997, Jim Dinning, the finance minister at the time, drops a budget with a lot of surplus, with some tax cuts, some additional spending, and then there is an election basically the same day. I'm wondering if that's where the government is going. They come in with a major surplus, throw out some cash, maybe bring back the tax bracket indexing here, throw something out for everybody, and they run a budget based on that. I actually think that that's what they're planning on doing.
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting forecast to make. It ties into something, though, I was thinking about before we jumped on this call today, is one of the things, going back to your time in government, and even finance ministers when you were a cabinet minister, there was lots of talk at that time about Alberta has to get off the oil royalty roller coaster. We have to get off of this endless kind of ups and downs of the oil market. And Travis Taves and some UCP staffers have said publicly, we're seeing a lot of positive things due to increased tax revenue and diversification, which is fantastic. But we're also in the position we're in because of an oil recovery. The idea that we'd be going into an election with another surplus just kind of plays into that idea that we're still at the whims of the price of a barrel of oil. What does the government need to do to get away from that? Or can we ever get away from that, given that, like, as you said, we could have an election campaign that's based around a $10 billion surplus and tax breaks and money thrown around for everybody?
So that's a decent point. And I will say this is that oil, I was doing some research today, oil and gas is still 17% of our GDP. If you go back 30 to 40 years, it was a much higher percentage of our economy. So as people want to move to a more green economy, you want to diversify our economy, that has been happening. But I think that the government should move a little bit further down those roads. The challenge here is going to be, we do have a $100 billion accumulated debt. That is still the lowest in Canada, but just to let you know, $2.7 billion of every year at record low interest rates, it's just going to rise, goes to interest payments. Mm-hmm. So that's 4.5% of government expenditures. That's larger than some government departments. So I would suggest the challenge is going to be to reduce our debt, reduce the interest payments, and perhaps plot a role consistent with what Peter Lougheed had envisioned with the Heritage Fund. The Heritage Fund is $17 billion. It generates money every year. It is inflation-proof. So perhaps the government wants to look at reinvesting in that to a certain degree once the debt is brought down. The other thing I've noticed is that the government is really trying to attract a lot of other businesses to Alberta. For example, the tech sector is very mobile, and you're seeing a burgeoning tech center in Calgary. I would say a lot of reason to do with that is because of the reduction in the corporate tax rate. Joe Biden is raising the corporate tax rate in the United States. It makes Alberta a very attractive place to start a business.
And we'll end on that. Jonathan Denis, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
That's it for Under the Dome this episode. Don't forget you can find all past episodes at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome. Plus, you can hit that subscribe button on YouTube. I'm Dave Breakenridge. We'll see you next time.